One of the most powerful, the most sensitive, the most potent human functions and bodily urges is one's sexuality. One's sexuality is a very powerful behavior because through the power of sexuality, you can actually create something new, a new child, which is a very godly behavior of creating something new, something most humans cannot normally do. When we create new thoughts or new ideas in our mind, that's also powerful, but we're not creating a distinct new entity outside of ourselves. But through the power of our sexuality, we can actually give birth to a new child. Therefore, sexuality is not a bad thing, according to the Torah. It's a good thing. It's a holy thing. It's a God-given ability to procreate. But because of its awesome power and potency, it's most important that we use it and access it in a very holy way, in a very purposeful way. And that makes us godlike when we engage in that behavior. However, because of its extreme power and sensitivity, it can also be misused, abused, when it's channeled for a very unholy purpose in a misdirected way. And when we do that, it becomes a very grave sin. What is the effects of the sin of abusing one's sexual power, and how can one do teshuvah, one repair that? That's the discussion in today's portion of Tanya. Now, I will mention as an introduction that in Kabbalah, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of holy sexuality and about the grave sin of abusing the power of one's sexuality. And there's a lot of discussion because it's a very powerful force and it needs to be spoken about the consequences of using or abusing it. In Hasidic teachings, especially in Chabad Hasidic teachings, it's not discussed very often. There are a few places in the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe addresses it, but not in so many of the general Chabad Hasidic writings. And the reason for that is, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains, is not because it's not an important matter. It's a very important matter. However, the question is, how does one deal with it? And the Rebbe writes that the more one is preoccupied with thinking about it and talking about it and teaching about it, it may not be of benefit. It may actually be, there may be something harmful in that, because it's that kind of a topic that the more you think about it, whether you're thinking about its values or its or the problems of abusing it, it actually triggers a person in an unhealthy way and can even lead a person to greater sin. So therefore, the general approach is not to think about it so much, which means to be distracted, to turn away from it, and just focus on living holy and living purposeful, as we've been discussing in earlier classes. Now, when it does come to light, we need to address it, of course, but one of the most powerful ways of addressing it is not by engaging in thoughts and discussion about it, but rather of leaving it at the side of the table and not becoming preoccupied with all kinds of thoughts about it, which may actually distract us in a harmful way. So let's discuss about what happens when somebody abuses this power and how can one repair it. We learned in the previous class that in terms of behaving inappropriately and doing something not allowed, there are two categories. One category is when there's an object, a phenomenon in this world that is forbidden according to the Torah. And then when you engage in doing that forbidden act, whether it's eating something not kosher or doing something which is not allowed. So that object, that item which is forbidden, which is asur in the Torah terminology, is because it's a recipient of energy, of life force from the three forces of impurity. In those levels of impurity, the klipa is so strong that the divine creative force within it is completely trapped and imprisoned. And therefore, it's irredeemable. And therefore, when you interact and behave in a forbidden way, you take part of your soul energy, part of your life force within you, and you lower that, and you imprison that within the clutches of these three impure forces. And that becomes something irredeemable that has very harsh consequences. Is it possible to bring redemption to that divine energy which you lowered into that realm of imprisonment? So the Alter Rebbe said there is one possibility. It's a very difficult one. If you're able to achieve a level of teshuvah, a level of repentance, me'ahava, which is generated by such an intense, powerful fiery love and yearning and thirst towards God, and experience a thirst that you would never have been able to experience without having experienced the sin. So then the sin becomes part of this, is what led you to this enormous experience of attraction to God. That's a way to redeem it, which is the power of the Baal Teshuvah, when you can achieve that level of Teshuvah. But a regular level of Teshuvah, of wanting to strengthen your relationship with God and regret for what you've done, but not achieving that new level of thirst and yearning towards God, will not be able to redeem that sinful behavior. The other category is when you take something that is mutar, that is permissible, which means like a regular kosher food or a regular kosher activity, and it's chayus, its spiritual energy is not coming from the three impure forces, but it's coming more from neutral klippa forces. Remember, we said that there's klippa noga, that transparent klippa, where there the divine energy is concealed within that, but it's not imprisoned within that, so it can always be elevated and redeemed. When you pursue a permissible activity, however, you don't have any divine, godly, altruistic motivation or intention with that, but rather you're just looking to satiate a craving, an urge, a desire, a lust for your own selfish glutton needs. So in that kind of behavior, you do take the energy within that food and you do lower it into the level of the three impure forces. However, the energy does not become trapped and imprisoned by that, because by nature it's a neutral energy of transparent klippa. So it lies there, and there's a contamination in your soul and in the world. However, through a regular process of teshuvah, of restoring your connection to Hashem, regretting for what you've done, and committing to not to do it again, that alone is sufficient to redeem all of that divine energy which you lowered into the power of those impure forces, and to elevate it and restore it back to its source, back to its creator. That's what we discussed in the previous class. Now let's talk about the abuse of one's sexual energy. There are, it appears in the Torah, to be two different categories, because there's a whole section in the Torah that discusses forbidden relations with someone who's not your wife, not your spouse, or with someone who is forbidden to you. That's one category, and there are many, many different categories within that. There's another sin, another abuse of sexual power that's not in that list, but it's mentioned on its own elsewhere in the Torah. And that is the sin of wasting one's seed. Not with a spouse, not with another person, but on your own, wasting your seed. Why are they listed in two different places in the Torah? Because they are two different, very different sins. On the one hand, the Zohar, the Kabbalah, tells us that the sin of wasting your seed on your own is much worse than the sin of wasting seed in terms of engaging in a forbidden relation with somebody else. Because the quantity, the amount of impure forces that you generate and you create through the waste of seed is much greater, is much larger than engaging in forbidden relations with somebody else. The language in the Zohar is that when you waste your seed, you create a mabul, you create a flood of impure forces. Think about it. Within that genetic material is the powerful life, which means there's a very strong, intense presence of godliness, of God's divine creative force within that. You could have created something, and you took something that had such enormous potential and you wasted it and you spilled it. So the sin, the loss, the destruction in that is very, very powerful and intense. It creates many more impure forces than just engaging in a forbidden relationship. However, in terms of the quality and the nature of the level of impurity that you have created, engaging in forbidden relations with another person is much more severe than when one just wastes their own seed. When you're engaging in this forbidden relation with another person, you have taken your seed and you've implanted it within another person, so it's become more cemented and concrete, present here in this world, and it creates a much more intense nature of impurity. And therefore, that becomes the classic example of energy that has become bound within the three impure forces, which are irredeemable, And the only way one can redeem that is if one will engage in this intense, powerful of teshuvah, me'ahava, out of love, where the sin becomes part of the teshuvah, and then it can be redeemed. However, when it comes to the sin of wasting one's seed, even though the amount of impure forces is much greater than when one engages in a forbidden relationship, but the qualitative nature of that impurity is not as severe as engaging in forbidden relations. And therefore, even though it's a sin, and even though you are, through that act of wasting seed, you are strengthening the forces of impurity in this world, however, it is possible to repair and redeem that sin even through a regular level of teshuvah. They're not so asur, they're not so bound in the clutches of those forces. In fact, the Zohar tells us and the Talmud tells us that a level of teshuvah primarily during reciting the Shema at nighttime. We recite the Shema before we go to sleep. And in the Shema, it's the prayer of Shema, recognizing the unity of God and committing ourselves to loving God. And there's also other parts of the ceremony in terms of doing teshuvah, reflecting on our day, making a cheshbon nefesh, an accounting of our activity and behavior during that day. And there's the tachanun, there's some confessions during that ceremony. Saying the Shema at nighttime with great sincerity and great kavanah, that alone is sufficient to redeem and repair the sin of wasting one's seed. The Talmud says that whoever will recite the Shema with sincere kavanah on their bed at nighttime, they create within themselves this double-edged sword. And the double-edged sword, one sword is able to slay those forces of impurity which have captured the energy, the God energy that you have spilled through the wasting of the seed. And the other sword has the power to extract the divine energy within that shell, that klipa, and elevate it back to its source. So here's an exception to the rule that generally when one sins with something forbidden, it's irredeemable unless there's a very unique power of teshuvah. One exception is the wasting of one's seed, even though it is a very harsh sin and has very grave consequences. However, through a sincere level of teshuvah, especially during the Shema at nighttime, you can redeem, you can repair your behavior and restore your soul back to its original source. There is now another exception when we talk about forbidden sexual behavior, and that is if someone engages in a forbidden relationship with somebody that they're not allowed to be intimate with, and through that they give birth to a bastard, illegitimate child. If that happens, then that act is so irredeemable that even the powerful level of teshuvah, me'ahava, teshuvah out of love, which normally will be able to redeem even the worst of sins, because as we explained, the sin becomes the impetus into experiencing the level of teshuvah, but here it becomes irredeemable. Like the Talmud says, what is a sin, what is a mistake that one can never fix? If one gives birth to a bastard, illegitimate child. Because no matter how intense your level of teshuvah is, within your soul, you have restored your relationship with God and with your Creator in a most genuine, sincere way. At the end of the day, the product of that union, which is that child, always exists. And that's not something that no action you take could ever eliminate that, could ever erase that. And so it's a stain that lasts forever. So in summary, Judaism teaches that one's sexuality is very, very holy. It's not a bad thing. And this is what we need to be educating our youth with, especially when they're growing up in their formative years. The reason why we need to be extra careful about how we use and how we access and treat our sexual power is because of how holy and sensitive it is. And when used right and channeled towards a purposeful mitzvah, it is unbelievable. It creates a union between two people. It cements a love, a relationship between two people that no other action between them can. And it can actually procreate, give birth to a child, which makes one the most godlike. And because of that, they need to be very careful about abusing and wasting one's sexual behavior. It becomes very destructive spiritually in terms of the forces of impurity it creates, destructive emotionally, destructive internally. It's a very toxic for a person's psychology and a person's even physical body, when one doesn't treat it in the respectful way that it deserves. And that concludes chapter 7. God bless you. Have an amazing day.